Nigel Farage could be banned from hosting his GBNews show under a Labour crackdown on MPs making paid media appearances. Parliament's Modernisation Committee, a real thing, which is being chaired by a Labour frontbencher Lucy Powell, today published a memorandum agreeing to look at tightening rules on second jobs. But is this move actually a chilling attack on free speech and, crucially as well, GB News? I'm joined now by Reform UK's Immigration and Justice spokesperson, Anne Widdecombe. Anne, thank you very much. Now, Labour might think that they've got a tricky time getting at us through Ofcom and all of this stuff. But actually, if they can just knock Nigel Farage out of play by doing something like this, then why wouldn't they do it?
Well, indeed, and I think if you look at the whole argument around MPs' second jobs, you have to make so many exceptions that at the end of it, what you're really doing is choosing who you're going to prevent from doing second jobs. And that seems to be what's happening here. They've said, right, well, it'll be people with paid media appearances. But where are you going to stop? I mean, supposing you've got somebody who's come from the media, who's still got a profession there, who wants to make, say, a documentary. I mean, never mind present a programme, it just wants to make a documentary. I did plenty of those while I was an MP. A, it didn't interfere with anything that I was doing as an MP, and B, nobody thought it was peculiar.
The only reason they would want to do this, as far as I can tell, is if there was someone with a prominent platform that they didn't like, who they thought that they could silence. And I look around, David Lammy doesn't do his LBC show anymore, Ed Balls is a retired Labour politician now, despite, of course, being married to our Home Secretary. So actually, really, the only person this affects is Nigel Farage.
Well, it's certainly the only person it affects in terms of, an ongoing, regular appearance. But what are they going to do about people who do one-offs, as I've just said? Are they going to include them as well? And if not, what possible grounds can they have for excluding Nigel?
So, conceivably, what could happen is that the Labour Party, every single day, the government, gets the opportunity to put a minister up for a morning round. They also could maybe decide which ones of their Labour politicians are allowed to do columns in newspapers, for example. But if another MP from another party wanted to be paid to write a newspaper column or do a television show, that would be banned. And I think that's quite chilling.
Well, they've got to decide exactly what they're going to ban. Are they going to ban, one-off articles in newspapers on subjects of expertise? Are they just going to do a blanket ban on anything to do whatever with the press and media? What are they going to do? They haven't actually told us, Patrick. We don't know.
No. There is an argument, though, and some people really do fully subscribe to this argument, that if you're elected to be an MP for a particular constituency, then your entire sole focus should singularly be on that. I.e., just to continue with this Nigel as the example, that the fair people of Clacton might benefit more if Nigel Farage spent all his time there focusing on them.
I can't imagine anything worse than a parliament full of people who have no connection with the outside world beyond the job that they actually do. I can't imagine anything worse. And then, of course, you start on the exceptions. You've got the doctors, the dentists. Well, they can't stop practising after, 10 years. Would you want your teeth pulled by somebody who hadn't done it for 10 years? And so the exceptions start, as they always have. And then, as I say, if you have enough exceptions, then you come down to the people you're discriminating against.
Do you think that if this did become law, Nigel Farage would just break the law?
Well, of course, Parliament can impose its own penalties on MPs who do that. I don't know what he would do. You've got to ask him that. But I think the best solution to this is to resist it becoming law.
You raise an interesting question there. This ties in wider to the second jobs issue when it comes to MPs. And I have my own theories about why Labour might want to clamp down on this. And I will just say it, which is that if you have somebody who is desperate to work in the private sector and go and make a bit of money in the city or set up their own business or do all of this stuff, that would, therefore, essentially exclude them from going into politics. So you might end up with the kind of people who are not particularly inspired by any of those things. Now, I do not want to generalise overly here, but I suspect most of those kind of people would lean towards the left. And therefore, you could stack the deck with a load of lefties.
You could certainly have a very, very second-rate parliament if you've got people who can't carry on with paid interests in which, they have a legitimate, not only a legitimate interest, but from which they can bring expertise into the House of Commons. It's why do so many barristers in the House of Commons practice? The answer is because if they didn't, they wouldn't be capable of doing it in a few years' time.
What could the possible justification for this be, though? Let's have a look. So they would say, well, we want to spend more time with your constituents. We want it to be the sole focus. They could say that it might get rid of vested interest. They could say, in the case of Nigel Farage, here on GB News, presenting a show Monday to Thursday or back, prior to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Well, I suppose he's the case against that, isn't he, because he lost his seat. But, Nigel can use that platform to self-promote and therefore politically promote, and that is in some way unfair.
OK, then, so you get an MP who writes bestsellers. Do you forbid that as well? Because, if somebody is in the public eye because of that, are you going to forbid that? There are just so many. As I say, in the end, you've got to end up making a whole raft of exceptions, and therefore you end up with a small persecuted minority, if you want to put it that way.
The cynic in me would say that Labour might have weighed this up. I've got no doubt they would deny this, that Labour might have weighed this up and thought it might be a bit too tricky to come after us through the means of Ofcom and get us taken off air or anything like that. But if they can knock out a big hitter at GB News by doing something like this, then maybe they would do that. Of course,
I'm sure that's featured in the discussion.
Well, of course, there is no suggestion of that at the moment. I wouldn't want to preempt.
I'm not saying that that's their motive, but I'm saying I'm sure it's featured in discussions.
I do wonder. One wonders, don't they? And thank you very, very much. That's Anne Widdecombe there, who is Reform UK's Immigration and Justice spokesperson. Great to have you in the studio. Thank you very much. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has once again sparked outrage after he said that newly released prisoners should be prioritised for social housing. So on Tuesday, more than 1,600 violent criminals, sex offenders, etc., were just let loose onto Britain's streets under the government's early release scheme. And speaking to the Times' Crime and Justice Commission yesterday, Khan said, "We need to have an honest conversation with our constituents about the reasons why people who have come out of prison may need to jump in the queue to get housing to avoid them reoffending again." Well, those comments were slammed by Tory leadership frontrunner Robert Jenrick, who earlier today accused Labour of putting decent people last. Well, there we go. I'm joined now by former Labour advisor Matthew Talbot. Matthew, great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for making the time for us this evening. Is he right then, Robert Jenrick? Are they putting decent people last, putting a criminal up the housing waiting list?
I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't be like there's a leadership competition on at all for Robert Jenrick to be diving in on something Sadiq Khan said. But I think, I don't know, that the framing of the question suggests that people that end up in prison can't always be decent people. Many people in life make mistakes, some much bigger than others. And again, you alluded to it in your introduction. I will reserve judgment for things like sex offenders, paedophiles and other things. But for those that sometimes initiate crimes of potentially poverty or for want of other reason, I wouldn't necessarily say that people who've been to prison aren't decent.
I do appreciate that. Look, I do appreciate what you're saying there. What I would say, though, is, well, what message does this send out to anyone who just abides by the law? So people who might have gone shoplifting when they were hungry but didn't and have waited on the housing waiting list, then all of a sudden the London mayor says, "I'm really sorry, but this bloke with, even if it's petty crime, but convictions as long as your arm, does go above you in the housing waiting list." It feels a bit like the social contract would be broken there.
Well, I would agree. The social contract for me already feels broken in that, me and you probably always were brought up in that if you work hard and you abide by the law and you get on in life, you'll be able to afford a home and have sort of quite a nice life. And it doesn't seem to be the case. I think in regards to prioritising, I think what Sadiq said is we need to have a conversation. I think that's fair enough in many ways. I think the other thing is there are many... The evidence is there that if people that leave prison find relatively permanent housing, they don't go on to reoffend. And reoffending costs us all, through the Home Office, £20 billion a year. So I think there's an economic argument to show that certain people should be prioritised, but that can depend. Obviously, you can have prisoners that are of old age, that are potentially mentally ill or have learning difficulties, physical disabilities, or maybe fleeing violence or persecution as such from whatever they've been involved in. And I think, how you prioritise those and for those that are already on the waiting list is a tricky thing. I think the main thing is we need to be building more housing.
Yeah, we do need to be building more housing. I just think it plays into the perception that in Britain, very often, it seems to be law-abiding Brits who are at the back of the queue for everything.
But on the flip side of that, if we've got to ask ourselves, how do we wish to treat prisoners once all is said and done? if you have broken the law, you've ended up in prison. You've done the punishment. You've been in prison for maybe 5, 10, however many years. You've got a criminal record that could last up to 10 years, maybe longer. You're going to find it hard to get on in life. And, it's right that people are punished. I'm not saying, people shouldn't be going to prison for certain things. But ultimately, when is enough enough? Once you've done the crime and you've done the time, surely we have to ask ourselves as society,
I would hate for a situation to occur where one of the victims of those crimes gets bumped down a social housing waiting list for the man or woman who did commit that crime against them, though. And I'm not quite sure. I'm just not quite sure why Sadiq Khan says this stuff. Like, is he trolling us, do you think?
I think it's popular to dislike Sadiq Khan. He does say some things at times where I think, well, I certainly wouldn't have advised that. But I don't know, he's opening up a question that actually politicians may not have the courage to even entertain. The idea that, economically it's causing chaos. The fact that we are, even more recently, in the more recent riots, we've got people going to prison that really probably maybe shouldn't be going to prison for saying things online, and whether we're too harsh with our convictions sometimes. Keir Starmer has a record of that previously with the 2011 riots when he was head of the DPP. So it also opens up the argument of whether we're sending people to prison far too easily, which the current prison minister would agree. He seems to think 2/3 of people shouldn't be there at all.
I do worry, right? So there's a lot spoken about, especially by the likes of Sadiq Khan and Keir Starmer, when it comes to language's importance in politics. Language really matters. Language really matters in life. OK, all right, I get that. But, we've had Sadiq Khan, who relentlessly seems to be calling out things as racist. If you're against what's going on in the Channel, and you might be a racist, and all of this, if you're against all the pro-Palestine stuff, you might be a racist, you might be a member of the far right. And a lot of that stuff, for me, comes from things that actually people have got a legitimate right to be angry about. Well, now, if you're angry about the idea that someone who's, either battered someone in the street or done some crime and gone to prison for it, skips the housing waiting list, now are we being told that we're unkind?
Yeah, I can see your point. I don't think you're unkind, but I think we maybe need to look through the other end of the telescope and actually ask ourselves, what do we want? Do we want a society that gives people second chances, or do we cast aside people for the rest of their lives, which ultimately the victim of a crime may not want, because it may cause another victim of a crime because somebody has felt they need to go and reoffend further because they've not been allowed to get on with their life post-prison.
Yeah, no, look, hey, I think we can have a perfectly respectable conversation about this, as indeed we just have. Matthew, massively appreciate your time this evening. You take care. All right, Matthew Talbot there, former Labour advisor.